Hey, everyone. No, I'm not hyper-local celebrity podcast host Gavin Jackson. It's me, humble producer A.T. Shire. Okay, that's quite enough. Calm down. Now, I'm here to tell you that you're in luck, because this past Thursday, April 13th, we recorded an extra special live show at Kite Hill Brewing in Clemson, South Carolina. I know. Impressive stuff. Our intrepid host, Gavin Jackson, had state news reporter and friend of the pod, Maayan Schechter, on to talk 2024, State House, and more. So, without further ado, take it away, Gavin.
Hello and welcome from Kite Hill Brewing Company. How are we doing, Clemson, South Carolina? What a crowd out here. It's a rowdy crowd for our first live taping of 2023, and we appreciate everyone turning out. And of course, our friend of the pod, Maayan Schechter, is here with us too, all the way from Columbia. Thank you, Maayan.
So good to be here.
She is the politics editor at the state newspaper. Again, a great time to be out here taping. We have so much news this week that we're going to catch up on to. Before we talk about the State House, though, let's talk about what's going on the campaign trail in 2024, which of course runs right through South Carolina. You have to be living under a rock not to think that it comes through South Carolina, but so much is going on too, especially this week with Senator Tim Scott announcing his Presidential Exploratory Committee. He hasn't formally declared that he's running for president yet, not like Nikki Haley, but we're getting closer, one step away from that announcement. So Maayan, when we talk about that, we talk about 2024 and all the folks coming through, we're gonna have Florida Governor Ron DeSantis coming through next week too. We've had Mike Pence coming through. Where does this put Tim Scott in the whole grand scheme of things when it comes to what he's done, what the polling's looking like, how he stacks up against our other homegrown candidate, Nikki Haley?
Sure. So let's start with his appeal. Tim Scott really sees himself as an alternative choice in the 2024 field. He sees himself as a positive candidate, optimistic. He's not really a flamethrower like we've seen maybe of some other candidates out there. He's pretty calm. He doesn't kind of just tweet things all the time.
He's that good guy candidate vibe. It's pretty easy to do in a very feisty field right
now. He has a lot of popularity here in South Carolina. A new Winthrop poll came out, and in that Winthrop poll, he had a 47 approval rating in South Carolina, and that's out of all South Carolinians. And then he had a 25% disapproval rating. But among Republicans, it's very high at 69%, which a lot of Republicans in South Carolina never hit 69%.
Especially his counterpart, Lindsey Graham.
Right.
So, a lot of people have issues with him.
Right. So obviously it's incredibly early, and it would be super wrong to think that these numbers are not going to go up at all. But the latest Quinnipiac poll, nationwide, put him at 1%. The latest Winthrop poll, I believe, had him at 7%, trailing Trump and Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. But he certainly has, I think, a lot of time to obviously get that name ID up. He's visiting early voting states like Iowa, New Hampshire, and again, it's so early. But that gives him plenty of time to talk about his legislative accomplishments. He's talked a lot about opportunity zones. That is something that I believe he calls his signature legislative accomplishment on his website. So he's got a lot of time to build on his popularity here in South Carolina. And so it'll be interesting to see whether it translates to New Hampshire or Iowa.
Yeah, I was going to say it's pretty interesting because when I was on the campaign trail right after Nikki Haley announced, I was in New Hampshire and Iowa, and he was also in Iowa like in the last day or two when she was up there. And having heard her do her stump speech 5 times in a row, we're getting to that point now where we're going to be listening to those stump speeches. We can recite them. And then to hear him kind of give a very similar speech, I was like, I don't see much light between these two, even when it comes to policy issues, but especially like even personal narrative issues, with how she came into power and then, of course, appointing him as senator. I mean, there's a lot that they are using when it comes to selling themselves to voters out there. So it's going to be interesting to see how they differentiate in what could be a crowded field.
Yeah, and also whether they take shots at each other. I mean, that's what we all kind of look for on a debate stage, right? Whether somebody actually goes after someone. And so my question is, does Nikki Haley go after Tim Scott? Does Tim Scott go after Nikki Haley? Or is everything very kumbaya on the debate stage?
dance with the one that you brought to the dance. Now he is. But the former governor raised $11 million in her most recent fundraising report. We're going to get the full details on April 15th. But that was $11 million over 6 weeks, according to her campaign. And she had a solid showing. A lot of people will support that. Over 25 events. She has about $7.8 million on hand. But Axios, the news outlet, obtained a memo from her campaign in which she was taking digs at Trump, and she's also taking digs at Ron DeSantis. Obviously DeSantis hasn't jumped in the race yet, but it's heating up over there. So it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out, especially when DeSantis comes to town next week. I mean, she said to him, he has made one misstep after another, confirming what many observers have long suspected, that he's not ready for prime time. So really directing that rhetoric that's kind of been aimed at her before over the past years to him and trying to, sow some discord. So what should we be looking for when he comes to town in Spartanburg next week?
Yeah, and that latest Winthrop poll that I was mentioning earlier put them almost at a tie here in South Carolina. So the race here in South Carolina, I mean, it's really going to be between both of them. Number one, we have to see who shows up to his event in the upstate. We know he's got a couple of backers in the state Senate, Josh Kimbrell, also Danny Verdon, but we don't really know who else quite yet. He did get a big get today with Bill Stern, who had endorsed Trump twice in 2016 and 2020, was his state financial guru kind of guy here, and now he is on the DeSantis PAC. As a senior advisor, that's a huge get for DeSantis. So number one, who shows up to this event? My understanding is that it's expected to be a packed house, so that's very good. The second is whether he connects with voters or whether this seems kind of like a, hey, how are you? Nice to meet you, and I'm back in Florida. Obviously, Iowa has this stereotype when you're running for president, you got to shake everybody's hand at every single house.
99 counties.
Right.
They have 99 counties in Iowa. I'm like, just make it 2. I mean, that's South Carolina. They say the same thing about South Carolina, probably.
And so it'll be interesting to see whether he can connect with voters or whether it feels, like he's more of a Florida governor than a presidential candidate. But, again, it's early. He's got a lot of ground to cover. It's a great opportunity for voters to get first impressions of him.
Yeah, again, it's going to be hard when there are 2 homegrown candidates floating around and you're trying to lock down South Carolina. So it's going to be a lot of battles probably fought in Iowa, New Hampshire, with assumptions that obviously Trump, he's leading those polls still. So it's like they're all fighting for second, and whatever that means after South Carolina into Super Tuesday in 2024. So many flashbacks. But let's put 2024 aside because it's a little traumatic already to think about, and talk about the State House, where we have about a month left.
That's not traumatic at all.
It's a different kind of trauma. But we're talking about what's going on in the State House. We have about a month left in session of the first year of the 2-year session. And the big news this week was also the passage of the bond reform bill. That was a bill that was approved in the House, H 3532, which passed unanimously in the Senate after it was amended. A lot of words here. So what changes were made to that bill versus the House version, and how do we see this shaken out? It seems like it will make it to the governor's desk before signing day.
Oh, I think so. The governor hasn't used his bully pulpit for a whole lot this session. We've been kind of talking about it, just a little slow in terms of actually signing bills into law. There's a small handful, but the governor has used his bully pulpit for this bond reform bill. He really wants to end the so-called catch and release system that we have, where violent offenders are on bond outside of prison, and then they can recommit or commit very violent crimes. And so the bill that the House passed added, if I'm remembering this correctly, a mandatory 5 years kind of minimum onto someone who's out on bail for a violent crime and then commits another violent crime. And there's some other measures too in there having to do with cash bail. The Senate looked at it, and like the Senate does, they amended the legislation, creating more of a tiered system rather than just having a strictly mandatory 5 years, especially for gun felonies. This bill, as you mentioned, this bill has been pushed by law enforcement. They've been really lobbying the legislature to crack down on repeat offenders. And so, given the fact that the Senate passed this bill, I would expect the House to probably concur, to agree with the Senate changes, given that we only have, 4 more weeks of the legislative session. So it definitely seems like this is probably a bill that is going to go to the governor's desk much more sooner rather than later.
And I was talking to Sled Chief Mark Keel today for an interview for This Week in South Carolina, and he's very optimistic. Obviously, they had a press conference with the governor this week, talking about the bond reform bill, talking about some other common sense gun reform measures in the state, especially in light of the shooting at Isle of Palms over the weekend. And that reminded me of the shooting a year ago at the Columbiana Mall in Columbia, which was just as big of a mass shooting event too. So it's fascinating to see a lot of similarities playing out and folks wanting to make some moves, but again, nothing has happened since that shooting and the shooting since. So hopefully before the end of the session. But when we talk about penalty enhancements too, we're talking about adding more time or revoking bond or doing something on top of something that's already been charged, these folks have been charged with. But when it comes to hate crimes, not so much the case, right? Because that's also a penalty enhancement bill that has been approved by the House, bipartisan approval in the House, and it's also gone through the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's on the Senate calendar now, and it's been blocked by 3 Republicans, which you can do in the Senate. You can block, any one senator can block any bill for any certain amount of reason. But right now, 3 Republicans are blocking that bill, which, if you're tough on crime, you would think, why wouldn't you want to just add more penalties to someone who commits a crime, and they can prove that it was based on hate. So do we know where that bill's going, or is there something we're going to see next session?
We're in this phase of the legislative session, which is always the most...
It's like a pressure cooker.
Yeah, mind-numbing sometimes, because both chambers, now that we've bypassed the crossover deadline, both chambers are kind of playing this back and forth game. Are you going to pass my bill? Then maybe I'll pass your bill. And so that's going to happen for the next 4 weeks and probably into next year as well, since this is the first of a 2-year session. I mean, as it stands right now, I don't see how this bill moves. I think the people who had issues with it last year after it passed the House, in a bipartisan fashion, not unanimously, but bipartisan fashion, I think the same people are going to have the same issues with it this year, which is that they feel like it infringes on free speech. And there is some criticism of the bill altogether. It really only targets violent crime. It doesn't target
vandalism or something like that.
And so I think on both sides of the aisle there's some issues with it. But for the most part, the symbolic gesture of it, I think there is a great push. And we've even seen some Republicans, and I know we'll talk about Senator Tom Davis. We've seen Republicans really try to lobby to get this bill across the finish line. But I mean, as it stands right now, unless these senators who are holding up the bill get maybe something they want, I don't see it passing this year.
Which is not too unexpected, because we also are seeing the same thing going on with Senator Tom Davis's medical marijuana bill, which we were expecting. He was talking about getting that right out of the gate at the beginning of this session, because it passed the Senate last year. It's a pretty similar bill, but it got stuck in the House on a technicality pretty much. I mean, they were about to have a big debate on that bill, but it got thrown out, so they changed it around, and you thought that bill was going to move this year, and then all of a sudden, Republican infighting in the Senate kind of sabotaged that bill too. So there's a lot of that going on right now in the final weeks. So that bill is pretty much done for this session, as far as we can tell.
Unless something, I mean, we've both covered the legislature
long
enough where we've seen some crazy things occur. But I mean, as it stands right now, I don't know what else Senator Davis could do to get this bill passed. He has year after year after year. I mean, I think maybe this is the 8th or 9th year.
When I was working at the Florence Morning News, he had a field hearing in Florence with Jenny Horn, Representative Jenny Horn, who ran against Mark Sanford. I mean, like way far back. So I mean, they've been working on this, and then to say that it's not fully vetted yet, it's
right. It didn't go through the typical, I guess, traditional committee process, right? That's in the Senate.
I mean, it's moved through it enough to the point where they're like, okay, we've already done this, and then some people objected to it, saying it hadn't been vetted enough. But it's like, we have done this enough.
Yeah, so, I don't know what else he could possibly do. I mean, I'm sure there's some like maybe minor provision he can come back next year and tweak. But again, because it's the first year of a 2-year session, none of the bills die. They can come back up next year. So I'm sure Senator Davis is going to work really, really hard to push his bill, and possibly work really, really hard to see maybe other bills not get through if he can't get his through once more. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you've listened to the podcast, you heard some of our clips from that debate, so it's pretty passionate there. But speaking of infighting, let's pivot to the House, where the House Freedom Caucus was really the big, I don't want to say issue, but the big, I don't want to say star either. I don't know what word I'm looking for. The big, the focal point of this session so far is just, how much clout that the House Freedom Caucus, which is a select group of about maybe 14 to 16 far-right House members.
It's more like 18, but it's a squishy 18. So maybe more like a 16.
And we've seen deliberations every week when it comes to bills like the, Women's Hunting and Fishing Day to, getting into big debates over the House budget, which hasn't been as typical in the case because usually in the budget, everything's already kind of worked out. They're just approving things. So it's been a very fascinating session so far. But do they have anything to show for this besides all this talk? Are they getting things done?
So I think first you have to, it really depends on where you land, whether you are in the Freedom Caucus or whether you're in the traditional House GOP caucus. And then you kind of also need to define what is success. So if you are in the House GOP caucus, which is the traditional caucus in the House made up of all Republicans, they will say, we've been completely successful. They have not been. We've been passing legislation, bill after bill after bill. We have way more members than they do. If you ask the House Freedom Caucus, they will say, well, just because we don't have as many members, we have been equally, if not more successful because we have been putting issues to the forefront mostly on amendments or provisos, which are basically one-year laws attached to the budget amendments, up on the floor and making our Republican colleagues take tougher votes.
Yes.
Their argument is that Republicans are running in primaries and saying one thing, and then they get into the State House and say another. So both factions believe that they're super, super successful. Both factions think the other is not successful. I'm a big believer that we don't see a full impact until 2024. That's when we have an election. That's when it'll be clear, I think, to everyone whether the House Freedom Caucus has actually been successful in their messaging and other activities. And until then, right now, it feels like a lot of noise because most people don't understand House rules and things like that. So right now, it's a lot of noise, but really 2024 is where we actually see an actual impact.
And we saw a lot of that when we were talking about the budget fight too, with the diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI bills that they want to try and push through. You're seeing that happen in other states, in Florida too, which is having an effect, whether negative or positive, depending again, like how you come down on this issue. But if you think, professors and teachers leaving the profession is a positive impact, then yes, that's happening. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out too. But you are seeing bills like critical race theory bills going through the Senate that didn't go through the Senate last year, that did go through the House. So we're going to see how that plays out either this year or next year, again, 2-year session. So, but there have been some other bills moving through when it comes to education in terms of school voucher bills. H 3591 would ask voters if they would support eliminating the prohibition against the state or its political subdivisions from providing direct aid, to religious or other private education institutions. So basically asking the voters whether you would authorize the state to send money to private schools. That could be on the ballot in 2024 if that bill passes the Senate. But the House also passed a big bill on top of that to approve legislation for voucher schools. That was S39. I think the Senate passed that one, I should say. So that's in the House right now. So are we going to see this make it across to the governor's desk? I mean, school voucher bills, we saw that voucher bill last session get into a conference committee. That's when both are coming together trying to make it work, but didn't get to the governor's desk.
Yeah, I think that voucher bill has a better chance than the other bill asking for a constitutional question. One, because the voucher bill has already made it out of the Senate. It's already made it onto the House floor. It's made it, I believe, out of the full Education Committee, which is always a good sign, again, right before you get into the last stretch of the legislative session. The constitutional amendment question, I think, would be a little bit of a stretch, mainly because it's been sitting in Senate Judiciary. It hasn't even come up for a subcommittee hearing. Not that that's like a bad sign for a bill, but again, we're in this last stretch while we have 4 weeks, it's really, a handful of days and it starts getting squeezed every single day, and the Senate will be on the budget next week, so we have even fewer days.
Yeah.
I do think the voucher bill has a chance to get to the governor's desk, and he's probably been lobbying for that and has probably been pushing for that for some time. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we're in that weird sort of phase of the legislative session where the House and Senate kind of like, there's like a meme where everybody's like drawing their guns. Yeah, or something like that. Like,
that's where we are right now.
Everybody's waiting, like, are you going to pass my bill? You're not going to pass my bill? Well, I'm not going to pass your bill. I mean, that's kind of the phase that we're in.
The third Spider-Man is the people of South Carolina.
That's right. Well, no, maybe it's more like that girlfriend guy where he's like looking. Yeah, that may be a more applicable meme. Yeah.
I think some of our listeners will get those references, I hope. We're trying to visualize the podcast here. But yeah, Maayan, you're talking about some bills, and I'll ask you some bills maybe you think might move too. But fentanyl has also been a huge issue when it comes to the fentanyl crisis affecting South Carolinians and Americans. I was talking again, Chief Kill today about, I think we had some 1,100 South Carolinians die in 2021 just from fentanyl-based overdoses. So there's been a big push to crack down on trafficking and homicide related to fentanyl too. So I have to imagine, since a couple of those bills have passed both chambers, that we could see that get into the governor's desk in time.
I mean, possibly. So I think most of those bills are still sitting in subcommittee.
Each other's respective committees,
yes, they've passed the chamber. They're just waiting. And so, I'm sure the governor, and I know he's spoken about it, wants to get these bills out the door. Obviously, there is a bipartisan sort of push to also get these bills, I think, out the door, since it is a very serious issue. But we come back to that weird, jockeying kind of situation where it's like, who's gonna make the first move? And so sometimes legislation, as well-intentioned as it is, winds up getting stuck in the process. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, in wrapping up there, it's been a whirlwind couple of weeks. It's going to be a whirlwind couple of weeks too, especially with the budget moving through, with the Senate debating that next week. Some pay raises in there too. Again, but we started the session off talking about abortion because the state Supreme Court overruled the 6-week abortion ban. Now it's still the old laws on the books with the 20-week abortion ban. There's been no judicial reforms at this point. There's been no abortion law because they're both at a stalemate right now. So we're really kind of in this interesting place. And again, what do you see happening in the next couple of weeks as we wind up this first year of the session?
Well, I definitely don't see anything happening on abortion. I mean, I can't imagine them getting back to the negotiating table and doing what they did in the fall, the same thing right now. I do think these more school choice bills, these bond reform, fentanyl, have probably the greater chance because they are more
tangible and
right, and people can put real faces to those issues. And I know that there's another bill out there dealing with the ignition interlock, and there was some incredibly emotional testimony that happened on that bill the other day in the House. So, it's hard to see. I mean, I remember always a couple of years ago when the Panthers bill was still an actual thing, and that took up the entire latter half of the session. So you never know with the legislature what's going to wind up just, overcoming everything else.
Yeah. I was going to ask for a prediction, but there's
I have no idea.
There's nothing we can predict.
I don't ever predict.
I think we'll leave it right there, though. A lot to watch with 2024 and a lot to watch in the State House, too, in the remaining days. And that's a lot of great information there from Maayan Schechter. She's the politics editor at the state newspaper. Maayan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I love being here.
It's a lot to throw on one person, so I appreciate that.
I was really channeling Meg. Did it feel like I was channeling Meg?
Usually we have like 2 people, and I can go back and forth. We can play off each other. But we're going to do a Q&A session right now. Amy Crouch has a microphone, so if you guys have any questions about what's going on at the State House, 2024, questions about the podcast, feel free to give a shout, and we already got one question. We'll try and answer as best as we can.
How about the closed primaries? What do you think's going on with that?
So that, and I'm hopefully getting this correct, that it was in a subcommittee hearing the other day. I can remember, this must have been last year, when the same issue came up on the House floor as a proviso amendment to the budget. And a number of Republicans voted against it and spoke out against it, saying that it would limit them. Because they live in either a super red county or they live in Richland County, which it's very hard sometimes to run as a Republican. I don't think it's going to happen this year. Certainly, maybe next year. One of the things about that I learned from covering 2020 in the legislature at the same time, which I'm sure you did too, is that there's a lot of interconnectedness. And so you'll see a lot of bills that, frankly, you didn't think were ever going to get passed wind up getting
a lot of traction because of these candidates come to town and they start pushing these bills and they start getting attention and traction on them. So then it's like, let's push it through. Let's push through a close primary.
Exactly. Like they'll find lawmakers and link up with them and have them file legislation. We saw that with Kamala Harris. We've seen that with the recent ESG bill on the Republican side. And so, there's always a chance, but again, it'll be an interesting debate because I remember clearly Republicans being super outspoken about that happening during the budget debate. So if they do wind up passing it, I have a lot of Republicans I'd like to talk to about that afterward.
What is the impact of reformulating DHEC on the future of our state.
Harvey Peeler I wish we had Senator Harvey Peeler here to talk about DHEC reforms. I mean, I think that's been something how much they've talked about this session. I think they've had some hearings on it, but in terms of breaking up DHEC and making, some of the more regulatory aspects of it being a standalone agency versus some of the health aspects being its own agency too. I haven't really followed that as closely this session because it just doesn't seem like it's popped up as much.
Yeah.
But that will be something they'll be pushing because Harvey Peeler's been pushing that bill for a while now, and he's over Senate Finance, so of course there's some clout there too. But I think they're still really studying that issue, I want to say. I know DHEC just got a lot of money to get a new lab and all that stuff, so it would make sense to have all the health aspects of DHEC and Department of Mental Health and all those other ones kind of grouped together in DEOTAS versus, LLR and the nuclear regulatory aspect of our state and part of DHEC. So. And
I think there was a lot of attention obviously paid onto it after COVID, which really swamped up DHEC's role, and that was their primary focus. And so, there's probably even Democrats too who feel like it needs to be split up. But, again, when you split up huge agencies, you have to make a determination on where those leaders are going to be. Are they going to be elected by boards? Or are they going to be cabinet agencies? And, recently the legislature has been given away some cabinet positions to the governor, which is always really surprising that the legislature would give any kind of power. Yeah. So
hence the judge debate, right?
Right.
So judicial elections.
So yeah, I don't know what the actual impact. I mean, I think it's hard for us to say, right now what it would be.
Oh, this is our former ETV regular on our old show, The Big Picture, Ms. Holly Olber.
Sorry, it's not an econ question. I want to know about the anti-trans bills.
So let me think what they're
sitting in Senate committee. I don't think it made its way out yet of Senate committee. It didn't. It didn't make crossover. So it didn't. Yeah, it didn't get out of committee or onto the floor before that. Crossover deadline, which basically means that if it doesn't make it out of one chamber before, April 10th in this situation, it takes a higher threshold of votes to come out. So I think it's still sitting in committee. I think that committee is likely to pass that legislation. It's a pretty conservative committee, and it's a pretty conservative run committee. The chairman put Richard Cash in front as head of the subcommittee, and that's a pretty good indication of sort of how that bill is going to go. But, it could get super bogged down in the House, which I remember when the transgender sports bill continued to get failed after fail in the House Judiciary Committee before the former speaker pulled it out and put it in
special order.
Yeah, well, no, the Education Committee, and then they took it out.
Yeah. Because then they can also block it in the Senate too, but then special order.
So I think for now, it's not gonna get passed. I don't believe this year. It hasn't made the crossover deadline, but I would say just very much similar to medical marijuana into the hate crimes bill. That bill hits the floor, automatic names are going on it. Like Brad Hutto's probably putting his name on it. Every Democrat.
They're gonna block it.
Yeah, so it may just sit unless there's something that the Democrats feel very passionate about to lift their names off.
And that's when you see the back and forth when it comes to something like hate crimes not moving because they're objecting to something like that too. So it's those standoff moments in the State House where that's why nothing gets done.
Yeah, it's good to be a senator.
In the past few weeks, North Carolina has passed an extension of the Medicare, and I was wondering what's happening in South Carolina related to that issue.
Nothing. As long as there's a Republican in control, they're not going to expand Medicare or Medicaid. I'm sorry. That's just Medicare. It's just not anything. That's what you hear during the Democratic, like gubernatorial campaigns. You always hear about that. They always push for that. I'm going to get there. I'm going to sign this bill into law. But North Carolina's on a different page than we are.
They do. The interesting thing about it, and I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but I used to cover the budget, and they do spend a lot of money on what is essentially like Medicaid expansion, because healthcare costs continue to rise, and so they do put a lot of money toward it, but they don't call it, Medicaid expansion. We've not seen any bill that's moved anywhere. We've obviously heard Democrats, talk about it, but it just hasn't moved.
Yeah, it's been a big issue, but We're not North Carolina. We're not Georgia. We're South Carolina. I mean, we saw that. There you go. Well, I mean, I think we saw that. I mean, that's something that was interesting during the 2022 election. What year is it, right? I mean, when you look back to, the governor's race, right? Like everyone's always talking like, oh my gosh, is Joe Cunningham going to make a difference? Is he going to get close? I'm like, what we're watching for is how close is he going to get, right? Because it's not going to be like Vince Shaheen when he got within 4 points of Nikki Haley that first time around. And that margin has only grown bigger and bigger. And for Joe Cunningham to lose by, 17, 18 points? I mean, that was, I think, a testament to how people feel about some of those issues. So it's a long way away from something like that happening.
Yesterday, I think the Senate Education Committee was looking at the Transparency and Integrity in Education Act.
School voucher bill.
No, CRT.
No, not the voucher.
Okay.
CRT bill?
And so, yeah, some people consider that to be a censorship bill. Could you tell us what the status of that is?
Well, it was passed out of full committee yesterday. So, I mean, I'm sure it'll hit the floor within these next few weeks. Again, the Senate is on the budget next week, so they're not doing really anything else unless they sneak something in. So then that leaves them really with about, 2-3 weeks. We didn't see Senate didn't have an appetite, if I remember last year, to dealing with CRT, so it is very interesting. And I'll be honest, I did not see what changes the Senate made to that bill. I know they amended it, and I know that there's some discussion. There's some disagreement on it, but one way I've seen is that they kind of took out some of the more maybe controversial measures. But again, I haven't looked at it, so I can't attest to that.
I feel like we're just gearing up for a 2024 to remember. I mean, like everything's going to get pushed, and then it's going to be this big pressure cooker to get some of these big issues going through because all eyes will be on South Carolina. They're going to say you're not Republican enough because you're not doing these bills like CRT, like DEI, like ESG, and then
yeah,
I can see that push.
And lawmakers like to use some of these bills for the re-election. So
exactly.
What's more at the top of mind of voters? Do you pass a bill now and then nobody remembers 5 months from now, or do you pass it right at that
when the House and the Senate are up for re-election?
Mm-hmm. So it could come up on the floor. It's hard to say. Again, somebody's gonna put their name on it. Is the likelihood of it?
I actually have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I found this interesting because you told me today. Y'all were talking about the Winthrop poll, and also there was a national poll that came out. Can you explain what the difference is right now?
So when we talk about, where everyone's talking about polling, we always love to talk about polls because it's the only way we can, in a concrete way, see what's going on with the race without us just speculating based on what we think is going to win. But I think when we look at national polls, everyone's like, wow, look at these national polls. But national polls aren't really relative to what's going on when it comes to a presidential primary. Like you want to look at what's going on in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, like the Winthrop poll that just came out. That gives you the best idea about who's really doing the best in what state. Because once you start winning those states and the momentum starts building, I mean, that's how things happen during the primary. So the national polls are more what you would focus on closer towards the general election versus the primary. So keep an eye out for those.
I have a question for Maayan.
Uh-oh.
This has been quite a controversy on the podcast. We've had a lot of calls about it, Maayan. And I really want to know, do you think a hot dog is a sandwich?
I feel like we had this conversation a year ago.
It's got legs, and I can't explain why. So, Maayan, and give your reasoning.
I feel like whatever answer I give, you're gonna disagree with it.
Here's an answer. It's not a sandwich.
Right. You guys had hot dogs earlier, so you've already clearly cemented
I think it's
your
a sandwich.
opinion.
Yeah. But you don't think so?
I mean, it's definitely sandwich-like. It's like a sandwich.
If you cut it, lay it flat on bread, then it can be a sandwich.
Right.
And that bun, in cylindrical form, it is not a sandwich.
Is it tube meat? No. Tube meat? No.
Well, as you can tell, that's the intense conversations that we have here on the Lede podcast.
That's it. Hold on.
Brown liquor.
Are you playing me out?
Brown liquor.
Okay. Yeah.
Marlon Gibson won't be there much longer in the state
Very
Senate.
sad.
Brown liquor.
Is that our wind down section?
That's it.
All right.
That's it.
Do I need to do an outro?
Do it. Say thank you, Maayan.
Thank you, Maayan.
Oh, thank you, Gavin.
Everybody.
And thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Wasn't that fun? Well, I just want to thank everybody who came out to Kite Hill Brewing. Of course, I want to thank Kite Hill Brewing for hosting us. I want to thank Maayan for traveling all the way up to Clemson to talk with us. And of course, the ETB Endowment. Now, thanks for listening to the pod, y'all. Show us your appreciation by leaving us a review or a voicemail at 803-563-7169. Stay up with the latest on scetv.org and southcarolinapublicradio.org. Also, don't forget to support your local newspapers. For the South Carolina Lead, I'm not Gavin Jackson. I'm A.T. Shire. But anyway, be well, South Carolina.
I know what it is.
You're on, brother.